The wind blew hard that morning, carrying dust, hunger, and the sound of empty hearts through the small western town of Dry Creek. It was the kind of place that didn't care who came or went, just so long as they didn't ask for help. The sun hung low over the horizon, bleeding gold across a street lined with sagging buildings and tired souls. A dog barked somewhere in the distance, and a loose shutter flapped like a dying bird. Down by the old livery stable stood a man who looked like he belonged to no one, a cowboy, tall, silent, and worn by the trail. His name was Clay Donovan. He didn't speak much, didn't stay long anywhere, and didn't trust easy. He had the look of a man who'd buried more than he could remember, and still rode with ghosts that followed him from town to town. Clay was saddling up his horse, an old gelding named Whiskey, when he heard a sound that cut through the lazy rattle of the wind. It wasn't a shout or a cry, just a soft voice trembling from across the street. At first, he thought he imagined it. But then it came again, fragile and pleading, a woman's voice filled with something deeper than pain desperation. "Please, please give me work," she said, her words shaking as if they could barely hold themselves together. "My little girl hasn't eaten in 2 days." Clay froze, his hand still on the saddle strap. He turned slowly toward the sound. Standing near the general store was a woman wrapped in a tattered blanket, her face shadowed by a scarf worn thin from years of struggle. She was Apache, her features proud yet weary, her eyes dark and endless as a canyon. Beside her clung a small girl, barefoot, her tiny hands gripping the folds of her mother's skirt, her face pale from hunger. The pair stood in the dust, framed by the cold stares of townsfolk watching from behind their windows. Clay's jaw tightened. He'd seen that look before, the way people stared when someone was different, unwanted, forgotten. He'd seen soldiers do worse to women like her. He'd seen men call it justice when it was really hate with a badge. The memory made his chest burn. He pulled his hat down lower, stepped off the porch, and walked toward her. The woman flinched as he came closer, pulling her daughter behind her. "Please," she whispered again. "I can work, clean, sew, anything. I just need food for my child." Her voice broke on the last word. Clay stopped a few feet away. The girl peeked up at him, her eyes wide and hollow. For a long moment, he said nothing. Then, in a quiet drawl roughened by dust and sorrow, he said, "What's your name, ma'am?" The woman hesitated. "Naya," she said softly. "This is my daughter, Lila." Clay nodded once, slow and respectful. "Well, Naya," he said, "I reckon I got some work that needs doing. My coat's torn, my horse needs cleaning, and I could use a meal that don't taste like sand." Naya blinked, confusion crossing her face. "You would let me work?" Clay's lips twitched in something close to a smile. "Work's work. Don't matter who does it, long as it's done honest." The street went silent. A few of the onlookers muttered from behind cracked doors. One man spat in the dirt, but Clay didn't look their way. He'd long stopped caring what other people thought of him. He'd lived too long among men who judged before they listened, fought before they understood. He simply turned and motioned toward the edge of town. "Come on, I got a fire outside the livery. You can start there." By the time the sun began to dip behind the mesas, Clay's campfire flickered warm and steady. Naya sat near it, sewing a tear in his old coat with careful hands. The little girl ate slow, cautious bites of beans and cornbread, her cheeks smeared with ash and gratitude. Clay watched them in the firelight, his weathered face unreadable. He poured a tin cup of coffee and handed it to Naya. "Ain't much," he said, "but it'll keep you warm." She took it with both hands, eyes glistening. "You are kind," she murmured. He shook his head. "Just decent," he replied. "Kind's too big a word for what little I did." Naya stared into the flames for a while before she spoke again. "My husband," she said quietly, "was killed last winter." Soldiers came to our camp. They said we stole cattle. We did not. He tried to tell them, but they shot him before he could finish his words. My people scattered after that. I stayed. I thought maybe the town would show mercy. She looked up at him, tears trembling on her lashes. They did not. Clay felt his throat tighten. He'd seen soldiers like that, men who called themselves protectors but carried hate like a second gun. He'd seen too much killing that didn't need to happen. He poked at the fire with a stick and said softly, "I'm sorry, Naya. The world ain't always fair to good folks." She nodded slowly. "Still," she said, "you helped me. You listened. That is more than most." Clay didn't answer. He just looked at the stars above, cold, far, and quiet, and wondered what it cost a person to still believe in kindness after all they'd lost. That night, he gave her his blanket and slept near the fire with his coat pulled tight. He told himself it was just the right thing to do. But as he listened to the soft breathing of the child beside the flames, he felt something he hadn't felt in years' peace. At dawn, the sound of hooves woke him. Naya was already up, tying the blanket over her shoulders. "We must go," she said softly. "You have done enough." Clay frowned. "Go where?" She looked toward the hills. "Anywhere. We cannot stay here. The townsmen will not let us." He followed her gaze. A few men stood by the saloon, watching with that same narrow-eyed suspicion. He could feel their hate from where he stood. He spit in the dirt and looked back at her. "You're right," he said. "But it ain't safe out there, not alone. I'm heading north toward Coyote Bend. Big ranch up that way. Might be they could use help. If you want, you can ride with me." Naya's breath caught. "You would take us?" Clay gave a slow nod. "Wouldn't feel right leaving you here to starve." For a moment, she just stared at him. Then she whispered, "Thank you, Clay Donovan. You have a good heart." He looked away, embarrassed. "Don't go spreading lies," he said with a small grin. They rode out before the sun climbed high, the three of them, a broken cowboy, a widowed Apache woman, and her hungry child disappearing down a long dirt road that led into the endless horizon. Dust rose behind them like smoke, and somewhere in the distance, the faint call of a hawk echoed through the empty sky. Clay didn't know what waited for them ahead, but for the first time in a long while, the trail didn't feel so lonely. The road to Coyote Bend stretched long and empty beneath the heat of the noonday sun, a ribbon of dust winding through open plains and red hills that shimmered in the distance like ghosts of old fires. Clay rode ahead, his shoulders straight, eyes scanning the horizon for trouble, while Naya followed on the borrowed mule he'd traded for in the last town. Little Lila rode in front of her mother, small hands clutching the worn saddle horn, her laughter every now and then breaking the silence of the trail. For a man who'd spent years listening only to the creak of leather and the whisper of wind, that laughter sounded like music he'd forgotten existed. By the third day, they reached the foothills where the land softened into green valleys and scattered cottonwoods. Smoke curled from chimneys in the distance, the ranch Clay had spoken of. It was called the Coyote Bend, owned by an old friend named Hank Weller, a man Clay once rode with back in his younger days before life had turned him into more shadow than man. When they rode through the front gate, Hank came out from the barn, wiping his hands on a rag and squinting against the sun. "Well, I'll be damned," he said, his voice gruff but surprised. "Clay Donovan. Thought you'd turned outlaw or ghost by now." Clay swung down from his horse and grinned faintly. "Almost did. You still running this place with one hand and a bad temper?" Hank chuckled, but his eyes shifted quickly toward Naya and the little girl. The warmth faded. "She Apache?" he asked bluntly. Clay nodded. "Name's Naya. The girl's Lila. They need work." Hank frowned. "You know what folks'll say, Clay. They still don't take kindly to—" He didn't finish. Clay's tone stayed even. I know what they'll say. I just don't care. Hank studied him for a long moment, then sighed. Fine, she can cook, clean, whatever's needed. The girl can help feed the chickens. But if there's trouble, there won't be, Clay said, his voice low and final. So that's how it began. Days turned to weeks, and life at Coyote Bend fell into a steady rhythm. Naya worked from dawn till dusk in the kitchen, her quiet hands mending clothes, baking bread, and tending to small chores the men had no patience for. At first, the ranch hands kept their distance, muttering under their breath, but over time, her calmness softened them. She smiled when they spoke, shared food when she could, and treated everyone with the same quiet dignity that no cruelty could break. Lila became the heart of the place, running through the yard with the dogs, giggling as she chased chickens, her laughter echoing against the hills. Clay found himself watching her sometimes, remembering his own daughter, the one he lost to fever long ago. It made his chest ache, but it also gave him something he hadn't felt in years' hope. He helped Naya fix the roof of her small cabin by the barn, brought her flour and coffee when the supply wagon came, and taught Lila to ride on Whiskey's back. Sometimes, when the nights were quiet, the three of them would sit outside by the fire. The stars spread wide and silver above, and Clay would tell them stories of the old trails and the men who tried to tame them. Naya would listen, eyes soft in the firelight, and in those moments, Clay felt something like peace creeping back into his bones. But peace has a way of stirring envy in men who've never known it. One evening, just as the sun dipped red behind the hills, three riders appeared at the edge of the yard. Clay recognized one of them right away, Jess Duggan, a mean-spirited drifter who'd been thrown out of Dry Creek for brawling and worse. He dismounted with a swagger, spitting in the dirt as he eyed Naya, who was carrying a bucket from the well. "Well, looky here," he sneered, his voice loud enough for everyone to hear. Didn't know this was an Apache hotel now. Naya froze. Clay stepped forward, his eyes narrowing. "Evening, Jess. You and your boys lost." Jess smirked. "Just ridden through. Heard you was playing savior to some squaw and her brat. Thought I'd see for myself." Clay's hand hovered near his gun belt, but his voice stayed calm. "Ain't your business who I help." Jess's grin widened, ugly and cruel. "Maybe not. But folks in town been talking. They say old Clay Donovan's gone soft. Talking up with one of them wild women. Maybe you're forgetting which side you're on." Clay stepped closer, his boots grinding into the dust. "There ain't no sides here, Jess. Just people trying to live." Jess laughed loud and mocking. "You hear that, boys?" The Cowboy's found himself a squaw wife. One of his men snorted. The other just looked uneasy. Naya backed up, clutching Lila close. Clay's hand moved fast, grabbing Jess by the collar and shoving him hard against the post. "You got a big mouth for a man who don't know when to shut it," Clay growled. Jess reached for his gun, but Clay was quicker. The barrel of Clay's revolver pressed against his chest. For a moment, time froze, the air thick, the world silent except for the creak of leather and the pounding of hearts. Then Clay said quietly, "You ride out now. You don't look back. You don't speak her name again. You do, I'll bury you right here under this dirt you think you own." Jess glared at him, hatred burning in his eyes, but he saw something in Clay's face that made his courage falter. He jerked free, spat on the ground, and climbed onto his horse. "This ain't over, Donovan," he hissed. "You'll regret choosing them over your own kind." Clay holstered his gun. "My kind?" he said coldly. "My kind's the ones who still got a soul left." Jess rode off, the other two following close behind, their dust trailing into the dying light. For a long time, no one spoke. Naya stood trembling, Lila clinging to her leg. Clay turned to her, his eyes softening. "You all right?" he asked. She nodded faintly, her voice barely above a whisper. "Yes, thanks to you." Clay tipped his hat, trying to smile. "Ain't no thanks needed. Just keeping things fair." But that night, long after everyone had gone to sleep, Clay sat by the fire outside, the stars cold and watchful above him. He knew men like Jess didn't forget an insult. He knew trouble would come. And when it did, he'd have to be ready. 2 days later, it came. Jess and his men rode in at dawn, their rifles drawn, the sun rising behind them like fire. They came shouting, guns cracking, bullets cutting through the still morning air. Clay was already awake, his instincts sharp as the snap of lightning. He grabbed his rifle and ran toward the barn. Hank and the ranch hands fired back from cover, chaos filling the yard. Naya pulled Lila into the cabin, clutching her close as the windows shattered. Clay's voice roared through the smoke, "Stay down." He moved with the precision of a man who'd fought too many battles. One by one, Jess's men fell or fled. But Jess himself kept coming, firing wild, hatred twisting his face. Clay met him near the well, both guns empty. They crashed into each other, fists flying, rage and dust and sweat all mixed together. Jess swung a knife, catching Clay across the arm, but Clay didn't stop. He drove a punch square into Jess's jaw, then another, until Jess hit the dirt, gasping. Clay stood over him, chest heaving, the world spinning silent. "It's over," Clay said. Jess spat blood and glared up at him. "You fight for them now? You ain't one of us anymore." Clay looked down at him, his voice low but clear. "Never was." He walked away, leaving Jess in the dirt, beaten and broken. When it was done, the ranch was quiet again. Smoke hung in the air. Naya stepped out, her hands still trembling, and when she saw Clay bleeding but alive, she ran to him. "You could have died," she whispered. Clay smiled weakly. "Maybe, but then who'd keep the fire going?" She looked at him for a long moment, tears filling her eyes, then took his hand. "You saved us." He shook his head. "No, Naya, you saved me. Gave me something worth standing for again." She pressed his hand to her heart. "Then maybe we both saved each other." The wind shifted, carrying the smell of rain and the sound of birds waking in the distance. For the first time in years, Clay felt the weight in his chest lift. He looked toward the horizon where the sky turned from red to gold, and in that light, he saw not loss, but a beginning. The cowboy who once rode alone had found a home not made of walls, but of people, of trust, and of quiet redemption beneath the endless western sky.